team, I'm Caroline Quo. I'm so excited to do training today with you for the Our Family, Our Future study. Today I'd like to begin by introducing you to the Our Family, Our Future study and giving you a sense of why this study is so exciting and why we're so excited to work with you. I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about the background research that led to the Our Family, Our Future study that we will be doing together. I want to tell you a little bit about why we need this study, and I want to give you a sense of what the scientific goals of the study. Now, the goal of all of this is that you have enough background information so that you feel comfortable introducing and answering questions about the study to the stakeholders that you're going to be coming into contact with. That could be, of course, families themselves, but it also could be stakeholders such as community members and other key stakeholders that might be interested in how the study is going and what you're doing as a part of that study. So let's begin. Let's first begin by talking about the 3 preliminary studies that were done to prepare for this Our Family, Our Future study. I'm going to talk about each of these studies very briefly. The first was the Caregiver Wellbeing Study. The second was a Young Carer Study. And the third study, conducted with Millicent Attajuna, was the pilot study of the Our Family, Our Future program. In the initial study, the Caregiver Wellbeing Study, what we wanted to find out was what was happening with the adults that were caring for children who were experiencing HIV illness in their families or experiencing orphanhood, and what exactly was going on with the adults, the loving adults in their families that were caring for them. Those could be surviving parents or aunts or uncles or gogos or even siblings. And what we discovered was that when families are affected by HIV, illness, or orphanhood, caregivers in that family are experiencing a lot of mental distress. We saw rates of mental distress including depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, at high rates. We wanted to understand how mental health and HIV interacted in families, so we conducted the Young Carer Study. And specifically, we looked to see what was happening with adults in the family when families were impacted by both mental health challenges as well as HIV. In families that were not affected by HIV in any way, caregivers were not experiencing high levels of mental distress. So we saw rates around 43%. But in families affected by a child orphaned by AIDS, the risk for a mental health challenge went up to 48%. And then, when we looked at families where caregivers were experiencing HIV illness, risk for mental health challenges among those adults went up to 65%. And finally, when we looked at households where families were affected by HIV illness of adults in the family, as well as children being orphaned by AIDS, the risk for the adults in the family experiencing mental distress was very high, around 76%. We looked at patterns of mental distress or risk for mental distress in families from the child perspective as well, and we saw very similar patterns. So in households where children were not experiencing any kind of HIV impact, the risk for mental distress was quite low, around 13%. But as households become affected by HIV, so in this case, a child is HIV affected or a caregiver is HIV affected or both, the risk for the child experiencing mental distress went increasingly upwards. What we also discovered in our preliminary studies is that children know a lot about HIV. They even know how to use condoms, but they don't really feel motivated or don't feel prepared to implement behavioral prevention in a way that can protect them from either getting HIV or passing HIV and STIs to others. So you can see some of that here. Children, young people in our community, don't use condoms consistently. Many reported engaging in sex with casual partners, and some also reported engaging in transactional sex. So in sum, we really need to solve this prevention puzzle. We need to find out how we can motivate teens to care about their sexual and reproductive health, and to implement preventative behaviors at this really critical stage of teenager years, where we know that prevention actions now can have a really healthy long-term lifetime impact for them. So where does the connection between mental health and HIV and STIs take place? There certainly is an interaction between those two things. So, for example, we know that children or teenagers who are experiencing depression often are not able to implement the protective skills for HIV and STIs because they simply are not mentally strong or well. How does that occur? So for example, when you're feeling sad or disconnected from people because of mental distress, you might not actually feel motivated to implement all those protective behaviors that we know can protect you from acquiring HIV or passing it on to others. So great examples is, if I'm feeling sad and depressed, I might know how to use a condom, but I might not be motivated to do so because I'm not feeling well about myself or even the world around me. So there's this intersection between mental health and HIV/STI risk, where if you are mentally distressed, it might be harder for you to implement protective behaviors that protect you from HIV and STIs. What we also know is that the risk for depression increases astronomically around the teenage years of 14, 15, and 16 years of age, when also risk for HIV and STI acquisition increases. We'll talk a little bit about why that is later on in our training, but part of it has to do with the biological and hormonal and social changes that occur in those teen years that increase the risk for both HIV/STI acquisition and getting depression in those years. We know that there is some magic out there though. And what is that protective magic? Well, one of the protective magic pieces are families. We know that families are incredible sources of support and strength for teens, and that if we can tap into the strength of families and prevention, we might be able to support teens that are at risk for poor mental health and STIs, including HIV. And some of the specific ways that families can support teens in both staying mentally healthy as well as staying HIV and STI free is through things such as these. So parental monitoring. An example of that is when parents or loving adults in the families ask questions such as, who are you going out with? When will you be home? And they will check in with them if the teenager doesn't actually come home at the time that they said that they would come home. Or they're asked questions, who did you see this Saturday night and what were you doing with them? Those are all sorts of parental monitoring questions that can have really positive impacts on prevention. Other examples of why families are important in prevention includes family attitudes about sex. So a lot of communication happens around what adults in the family believe in around relationships and sex, and that gets absorbed by the teenager. So if parents or family members have protective attitudes about sex, so they say things like, we don't necessarily support sex at a young age, but if you decide to do that, then we want you to know how to protect yourself. Those positive prevention attitudes get translated from adults in the family to teens in the family, and they help the teens be prepared for preventative action when the time comes. And then the third piece is parent-child communication about sex. Often families don't know how to talk about relationships. They don't know how to talk about sex. They don't know how to talk about prevention, but they want to. So some of what we need to do in our prevention programming is build the confidence of parents in talking to teens about all those really tricky issues, and similarly, build the confidence of teens in asking their parents and families about how to protect themselves. So our program tries to do that as well. What was really surprising to us was that there are not a lot of family programs that focus on prevention and that tackle the issue of mental health and HIV and STI risk together. We think that there really needs to be family programs out there that tackle these issues together in the same program. And we actually looked at what was going on here in South Africa around these types of programs. And these two systematic reviews conducted around adolescents and around adolescents specifically in South Africa showed that there's really only a handful of programs that look at family prevention of HIV and depression in one go. So this program called Our Family, Our Future is quite special because it's one of only a handful of programs here in South Africa that try to tackle those big issues in this really positive and empowering family program. So I want to talk a little bit about the previous work that we did to prepare for this study, and this work was done with Millicent Attajuna. We conducted a randomized pilot control trial, and what that was that we were testing the Our Family, Our Future program with a small group of families, so 73 families, to figure out if they liked the program and if we could do a randomized control trial at a much larger scale, which is what we're trying to do now, today, with this team. And what we discovered was that families absolutely loved the program. We also discovered that prevention behavior change moved in the right direction. There weren't enough families to figure out statistically whether or not the program worked, but with the small sample, we certainly saw some movement in behavior that showed us that there was very promising prevention action that could take place from the Our Family, Our Future program. So what we're trying to do now as a team for this study with you as wonderful colleagues is to figure out, does the Our Family, Our Future work to prevent children, specifically teenagers, from getting depression, and does it also prevent teenagers from acquiring or giving HIV and STIs to others? So our goal is to recruit 880 teenagers and their parents into a family program called Our Family, Our Future. We're testing that program in a randomized controlled trial. So half of these teens and parents will be assigned to an intervention arm where they'll receive the Our Family, Our Future program. That's what this team, the intervention team, will be responsible for implementing. And the other half of the teenagers and parents will be assigned to a control arm where they receive the standard information for HIV and depression in South Africa, which is basically health brochures. What our bigger team will be doing is we'll be conducting surveys at baseline before the intervention assignment takes place, and then we'll also be conducting follow-up surveys at 6 and 12 months to see whether there was any change in behavior. The other thing that we're going to be asking in this study is what makes the intervention effective? So this second question here. That's a question that you all don't need to worry about. We will have some statisticians on the project that will be looking at this question using analysis. And then much later on, after the trial is going, we're also going to be doing some qualitative work to figure out whether or not there are any challenges for implementing the Our Family, Our Future program at a large scale, should this study show that it works. So we'll talk about this third question and we'll train for this third part much later on in a few years' time. Right now, we're really focusing on this question, does the Our Family, Our Future intervention program work for preventing HIV, STI acquisition, and depression? So the intervention team, which is you all, you're not responsible for screening families for eligibility. Your colleagues, who are the fieldwork outcomes team, will be responsible for screening families for eligibility. But still, it's important for you to know whether or not, it's important for you to know what the eligibility for the study is. So I just want to go over that quickly. For teenagers who are eligible for the study that your colleagues will be screening them for, they must be 14, 15, or 16 years of age at baseline. They must identify a particular adult in the family that is present with them. That might be a parent, an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, who is really present with them in the household and lives with them 4 days a week. And that's because we know that for this prevention program to work with families, teens really need to practice with a caring adult that lives with them and cares for them on a consistent basis. And then we're looking for teenagers that have some symptoms of depression. So they'll have to have a score of 9 to 15 on this depression tool called the CESD. But they cannot be at a clinical level of depressive symptomology. Because those teenagers, if they're really depressed, they actually need to be referred to help. And there's a process for that on our team. So we're really looking for teenagers that are below a clinical threshold for depression, who have some symptoms, but have not reached this crisis level of depression. And similarly for parents, we are excluding